So, we have a very interesting presentation this afternoon. Rob's going to introduce our speaker.
Great, so I just want to say welcome for the new season, welcome back, and we got a pretty good showing here for our first session. Usually it's quieter, so I'm happy to see that. But what I'm really happy about is that we actually have a local artisan come in to present today on furniture making, and I'm really happy to introduce from multiple requests, Chris Solar. Thank you.
So my name is Chris. I've been a furniture maker for nominally around 18 years, maybe the last 9 years in a more serious commercial way. I used to work in tech. I worked with Dean, actually, and eventually was a refugee from Nortel. Took some courses at Rosewood, gradually evolved from just being a hobby to thinking this is maybe something I'd like to do full time. So I'll just show you. That's where I work. This is on Gladstone Avenue, just west of Preston. Immediately to the right of this is the new LRT station that they're building. So that's been right outside my front door for the last 4 years is that construction. That's an old bread factory. I'm in the bottom level of that garage door. I took over the shop from another cabinet maker. So it's a pretty ramshackle building, and it's kind of a, don't ask, don't tell relationship with the landlord in terms of fixing stuff, but it's cheap and it's really close to home. So, and inside it's about 11 feet high to the ceiling, and there's a garage door. We've got about 2,500 square feet. Decent sized planer, a saw stop, a sliding table saw, that kind of thing. I originally got this space on my own, hoping that once I got it I could share it with people, and that came to be. So there was a guy on that far side who built boats. His name is Cam. So he made a bunch of canoes and rowboats and things like that, and then I shared it with 2 other furniture makers, one of whom is now an employee. So it's been kept pretty busy. It wasn't just me that whole time. But to back up, that's where I started out in my basement in a shop that's maybe a tenth the size. Just starting out as a hobby with an eye towards learning more about it and maybe doing it professionally. And I did my first sort of professional gigs out of this space, which was kind of crazy because there's no room whatsoever. But it was a start. It's what I had available before taking the leap to paying rent on that commercial space. So out of that era, so there's an example of a piece I made 2009, and maybe you can tell that I had just taken a workshop with Michael Fortune, because I feel that that's pretty obvious there. It was a big deal for me to finish a piece like that at the time because it had a lot of complex joinery and curved panel doors and all kinds of things I'd never done before. But at the same time, it was kind of a realization of this is not something that I wanted to keep doing. I didn't want to keep working with exotic woods like Wenge. I didn't want to base my work around figured veneers and that kind of thing. It just wasn't that exciting to me. And the other realization was, as a professional maker, building a practice around complicated one-off pieces is pretty tenuous. Like when you're working with a client to make something like this, it can take ages to go through the design and the back and the forth. Like months and months can go by before you get to the point of getting ready to start. And you just can't run a business that way. So in doing this and a few other pieces at that same time, I realized what I wanted to do was, I really like planar shapes. I didn't want to do complicated shapes and swoopy lines. Other people do it and they do it well, and just realize it's not really my thing. And I also wanted to have a basis of some production items that were easier for people to buy, easier for me to make, and that I could price predictably. So when someone says they want this or something like this, it's really hard to know what to charge for it because you've never made it before, or how long is it going to take. So guess I evolved my practice to include some production items like chairs and stools and things like that. And they're a good sort of backbone to have in the shop, because if someone orders 4 stools, I can just tell my employee we're making 4 of those stools this week. You know. So for instance, dining chairs, so that's a chair that I developed over the last few years. That's kind of more the aesthetic that I like. It's got simple forms, straight lines, predictable curves. That's just what I gravitate towards. It lends itself to doing multiples, right? And at a price point that, you know, they're expensive chairs, but they're not crazy outlandish, because the shapes have been kept simple. If you have questions at any point, please interrupt me so I'm not just prattling on. So those were made from white oak, from a log that I had milled from Westwood Lumber in Kingston. And that's been great, because then I could make a set of chairs or a set of stools and it's all boards coming from one log. I've never had that situation before, but it's, for something like this, it's really great. Those are some kitchen counter stools, again, in oak with wet formed leather seats and brass on the footrails. And that's something we also would do with Danish cord on the seats. So they're made carefully, they're mortise and tenon construction and all that stuff, but because they're a semi-production item, they're made to order, but all the details have been worked out. We have jigs for everything. There's no like guesswork. We know what's going to be involved in it. So that's kind of the flip side. The other side of the practice is still making custom cabinets and one-off pieces.
What's the production time, Chris, for those 4 chairs? How long would it take you to do?
It would probably take sort of elapsed time in the shop. The frames would be in production for a couple of weeks, but then you're doing other things at the same time,
Yeah.
because maybe you're laminating. The back slats are bent laminated, so you know. And then weaving the seats, I could do maybe 1.5 in a day. But there's a limit, like, I don't know if you've woven Danish cord before, but after weaving a seat, it's like, my hands don't feel quite right. So yeah, they still take a while. But. Okay. So that's one example of what we do. The other, when I was thinking back to those cabinets that had, say, exotic veneer or figured veneer, I just felt like taking a material that already had a complicated pattern and just sticking it on the front wasn't that creatively satisfying for me. What I wanted to do was take a plain material or even a compromised material and rearrange it to make my own pattern, if that makes sense. Well, hopefully that'll make sense as we go forward. And I guess an early example of that would be this series of cabinets that, this is walnut veneer. If you read Fine Woodworking, this was in an article I did a few years ago describing this process for making these doors. So the pattern on the doors is pentagonal tiling, which is I guess it's a mathematical pursuit of finding ways to tile a plane with pentagons. It's not a trivial, like a regular pentagon does not fit together to tile a plane the way that other shapes do. There are only a few types of pentagon that will do it, and mathematicians struggle to identify new ones. So this was a thing that I stumbled upon, and it kind of appealed to me from a mathematical point of view, but also from a design-wise point of view, because the patterns are quite beautiful. So this was a thing that was percolating for a while, and someone asked for a cabinet without, of course, specifying that's what they wanted, but it was an opportunity for me to try it, and they went for it. So those are all being sliced. That's thick walnut veneer that I buy from Certainly Wood in New York. So it's 1/16 veneer that I've cut into those identical pentagons. And it's all the same shape, just rotated and flipped. They're bonded on the doors, and I fill the lines, the gaps between the veneer pieces with black epoxy, and then sand it flat. And I thought, like, I could have done that with, say, ebony for the black lines, but I'm also a believer in expediency. So, like, there was a presentation I saw at a Furniture Society conference, and it was Wendell Castle talking about a piece. And I don't remember what the piece was, but it was something that had little black dots all over it. And I think everyone in the audience assumed they were ebony. So it was like rosewood or something with these black dots. And he said, no, that was PVC rod. I just hammered it in and cut it on. I was like, oh, yeah. He said, black is black. Like, who's going to know? So that's kind of where I went with that. The case here is extremely plain. I mean, it's 4 flat panels. The legs are straight. There's just a little bit of a curve on the bottom. And that's kind of the thing that I gravitate towards. Yeah, especially in case pieces, I want them to be pretty plain if there's something complicated happening on the doors. So that's, I guess that's a thing you'll notice. Those are 3 sliding doors, 3 compartments. And
Just out of curiosity, did it go to a mathematician or a technologist?
no, that's in the Canadian Embassy in Hanoi. But I've made at least a dozen of these, so they've not all to the government. There's in different sizes and shapes and colors, and so that's walnut and blackened oak. That's a much lower, like a TV credenza size. So that's about 56 inches long and 23 high, and that's white oak. That was on the door, on the pattern door, that was shops on white oak, just because I had it, and then using white resin. So these two are, that's a slightly different pentagon, but again, it's a tiling pentagon. And that's a bigger one, so that's 6 feet long. And that is an E-grade, if I'm saying that right. The client requested that wood to match some other furniture, so that's what I did. And then I had a fabricator make that steel base, powder coated steel base. So again, the material that I'm using is the plainest stuff you can imagine. It's all just, there's no fancy grain anywhere in this. And that's what I like. The pattern is something that I've created myself. So that's my cabinets. So here's something that I did for someone local. A house that they had built outside Wakefield. And when they cleared the land to build their house, they milled some of the maple trees they took down. So the guy was kind of an amateur woodworker, and he built this, he called it the Easy Bake Oven. It was this contraption in the garage for drying the wood. And he wanted me to use some of his wood. But when I got it, it was, like, it wasn't dried all that well in terms of, there was a lot of warping. So it wasn't really lumber that was going to be conducive to making a cabinet, because it was so twisted. But at the ends of the boards, there was spalting. Like, not enough to like do just a big panel of spalted maple or anything like that. It was just really in the last 6 inches of all the boards. So I thought, let's take that little sort of damaged end of every board and slice it up into little squares. So I cut it, planed it down, or sanded it down to 1/16 of an inch, cut them into these square tiles. So some of them are heavily spalted, like the one in the front, and some of them are less so, and some of them have weird staining on them. It's like the wood that you normally would just cut off and go straight in the bin. And then I just started laying it out for my 4 doors. So this is a common vantage point for me when I'm doing this, is I stand on a ladder so I can kind of look down at my bench and squint a bit and just rearrange things until it looks like a good pattern. And then those are bonded onto, laminated onto the door cores. Like that. And then it's just, for the rest of the case, I just use commercial maple, and I made little brass bowls. Come on, guys, questions?
Is it lacquer finish, Chris?
That is an oil finish, like a Rubio.
What do you use for the substrate, Chris?
That would be probably particle board, like 5/8 particle board. or sometimes MDF, but one of those two, because they're flat.
Or they just did a vacuum press of some sort?
Vacuum press, and then for that, because that's basically, it is a continuous sheet of veneer on the front, even though it's little pieces. The back side would have a maple veneer. Obviously, I didn't tile it on the back, but it is veneered on the back and to keep it reasonably flat. The cabinets with sliding doors, if I'm doing something elaborate like that, I might just put a backer sheet, the phenolic backer on the back, because there's no consistent grain direction on the front. And with the sliding door, you never see the back. And also the sliding door is riding on little rollers, so there's really only 2 points of contact. So if the door does warp a little bit, it's not the end of the world. It's not in a groove.
You use the panels just for dimensions.
Yeah, like I would use plywood, but it's just always terrible, my experience. Like it's always disappointing to try and get flat plywood, so. Okay. Yeah, I do mostly use oil finishes like Rubio or Osmo in the shop, but lately for case goods that are black, I will use a black tinted lacquer. And if there's an accent color on the inside, which is common, that will also be a tinted lacquer. Because especially for commercial clients, I think the lacquer is more what they expect. And I've struggled to get at least on cabinets, to get a black finish on an oil, like a black oil finish that I really like a solid black. If anyone has an idea for how to do that, let me.
Michael Fortune's recipe that I used on one of my tables
Yeah.
was you use dye stain,
Yeah.
and you also use
The pigments.
You also
the
use
dye and the
pigment
pigment.
stain.
Yeah.
because one will cast purple or blue
Yeah.
depending which one you use. So if you use both, then the cast is
Yeah.
gone.
So-
That's held up for over 20 years now. That piece.
And
It
there's,
hasn't
what's on
changed.
top though, is it like a lacquer or a varnish or?
I think I used wipe-on urethane,
Yeah.
like a gel top coat, general finishes.
Yeah. So those systems work if you put like a really solid, like a film forming top coat. But for something where it's just like an Osmo or Rubio, those dyes, they're not permanent enough. So in the end, black lacquer is pretty reliable. So this was a project that I worked on a few years ago, and it was a collaboration with a local artist who I already knew, named Adrian Goldner. And this was a commission for the Canadian Embassy in Washington. So this is quite a large piece. It's 8 feet long. And Adrian, being the artist, had the sort of high concept side of things. So we called it the River Cabinet, and it was meant to represent the two countries in that some of the wood, the darker wood, is cypress reclaimed from a river in the USA, and the lighter wood is ash that was pulled out of a river in Canada. And then the way we've arranged it with sort of swirling pattern is suggestive of the flow of water. So here, I guess, is another example of taking kind of a very imperfect material, these offcuts of these logs, and making something out of them. So that was the two of us at Logs End Flooring up in it's up the river on the Quebec side, and freezing our asses off trying to find suitable wood for the Canadian side of the equation. And then a like a reclaimed lumber specialist in the States just sent me this in the free of charge, and I explained what I wanted. This box arrived, and it's a chunk of cypress. And the growth rings are too close together to measure. It was pretty crazy. I don't know how old the tree was. But I basically broke it down into sort of billets, and then sliced them into these little
God.
membrane tiles.
Jesus Christ.
You can barely count them. They're this.
Wow.
Something.
Unfortunately, it also it had what's called ring shape, where the wood is coming apart on the growth rings. So if I cut these little slices, they wanted to just crumble apart like a stale cookie. Right?
Oh.
So I had to. This is kind of the tight wire act of doing pieces like this, because you never really know what's going to happen until you start doing it. So I was laminating them onto 3mm Baltic birch to make kind of a stable tile that wasn't going to fall apart, and then I could exercise.
Did you try stabilizing with cactus juice?
With what?
Cactus juice on your
I've
It's
never.
basically something that turners use for stabilizing wood.
Oh,
Basically, it's like an epoxy. What you do is you put it in
okay,
and you put it under vacuum.
right.
You leave it under vacuum until basically it impregnates everything in the wood.
I think
You take it out and you put it under heat and it stabilizes.
I think I kind of ended up there because these did get bonded down to their substrate with epoxy, and of course it bled through. So in the end, it got saturated with epoxy.
Yeah.
And so that's us, again, doing the, lay it all out on the bench and squint, and choose a layout. And so there's the carcass of the cabinet in front of us. And the cabinet, I had designed it, like this was an aggressively non-functional piece of furniture. It didn't have, kept asking, does it have to do anything? Nope. So I designed it with this like zigzaggy top, thinking no one can put anything on top of this cabinet, right? In the end, that wasn't successful because I've seen photos of it since with people sticking things on top, but whatever. So it zigzags up and down, and it zigzags in and out along the front. So I made, those are just MDF panels that have been cut with grooves at the boundaries of where the tiles are going to go, and those were painted black before the tiles went on.
Chris, with this, when you started your presentation, you mentioned how you started off with kind of complicated joinery,
Yeah.
and then kind of more simple lines.
Yeah.
Is this post or pre?
Well, it's a bit of both, right? Because it's all straight lines, but this was definitely a complicated geometry
It's
exercise.
very complicated.
Yeah, it's stressful. So it's good that I'm not only doing this kind of thing. I haven't done a piece like this since, but yes. I think I was asking my shopmates, like, next time you see me cooking up something like this, intervene.
That's very pure in
So, and I thought, okay, it's crazy to build like an 8-foot long cabinet that doesn't have any function whatsoever. So we did sneak in one drawer, you can see, mocked up there. And so there's a view.
Oh, nice.
And there's with little touch latches. And so inside that drawer, it's bare there, but there's a little plaque, an engraved plaque that has some the art speak that Adrian came up with about what this cabinet represents, and there's a chunk of these raw cypress and a chunk of the ash.
From left to right, it looks elevated. It looks like it's going up on a grade.
I guess so. It's
just a bit of an illusion.
it's a bit of an illusion, yeah.
It's a spectacular piece. Yeah, no kidding.
That's really cool.
So we're going to move on, like a different kind of furniture, but obviously similar. And a few standing screens. I've done that. I really like screens because there's not much function to them other than just the panels, right? And so there's a lot of room for doing something creative. This is pretty big. There's 7 feet tall, 2 feet wide, each panel, 6 of them. And I guess what I'm playing around with here is making a complex pattern again out of really simple things. The individual pixels, if you will, are just rectangles of very plain veneer. There's oak, and then I got walnut veneer, and one was darker than the other. And then last minute I was asked to incorporate silver leaf because the room this is going in has a ceiling that's all silver leaf. So sure, why not? So you can see on each panel there's 4 or 5 tiles have silver leaf on them.
Does the pattern signify anything?
No, like I played around, like I actually used a spreadsheet and like random number generation,
Ah,
and I would just keep clicking the checkbox in the corner of that spreadsheet, and it would generate a new pattern, and I would save ones that I thought looked promising. So I was using, sort of going back to programming here, I was using just randomness to see what I could do, and then it was randomness with some logic applied to it. So there were probabilities about the oak was more likely to be placed at the top and the darker woods at the bottom, and probabilities about how the boundaries between those regions would behave.
Using Excel is a great idea.
So, because otherwise there's too many pieces there to try and figure out. But then in the end I did like hand adjust things. Once I had to start putting in silver, I sort of wanted some consistent rules about where did the silver go, because it sort of looked like a raindrops falling down or water sliding down a window. So I called it the cascade screen, and that's
What kind of hinges are they, Chris?
well, good question. So it's pretty big, and it's too heavy a thing to move around if it's all connected. So I used lift-off hinges, and then what I did, the stiles of each panel are kind of a bull nose, and there's a detailed photo just for this very question. On the edge of the stile, I put a little round detail that lines up. This is a Michael Fortune trick that lines up with the barrel of the hinge. So it's not too prominent that you see the hinges, and I spray painted the hinges black to make them fit in. But then you can easily lift the panels off. So if the thing needs to be moved, or it could be reconfigured, right? As long as you have at least two panels, you can take out the ones in the middle. It could be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Right?
Does it need to be attached to the wall, or is it stable?
It's pretty stable. I mean, it's each one is 2 feet wide, right? So it's so the tiles were all veneered and cut, and the edges beveled, and I painted the beveled edges with black lacquer and then sanded it so that I got those really crisp boundaries. And they're vacuum pressed onto the cores, which are 1-inch thick honeycomb panel. So on the bench on the side, there's some other panels. So it's a honeycomb with 1/4 inch MDF. So that was the core, and then the frames were already milled and they were glued onto the, there's domino connections between the rails and stiles and between the stiles and the panel all the way around. So that's assembling the frames, and then the silver got put on after it was assembled, and then the final oiling. So yeah, pretty.
Is it pure silver so it tarnishes, or is it coated?
It's real silver, and if you see, it looks a little bit yellow because the silver in this residence, it was old, and so it was tarnished. So what I found out was you could use a solution called liver of sulfur. It's a sulfur solution that will turn silver anywhere from a little bit yellow to black, depending on how strong. Like jewelers use it to do black on silver. So I made a very, very dilute solution of that, brushed it on, and almost immediately you wipe it off, and then I put a clear coat of lacquer so that hopefully it should be more or less stable. So that's one screen. I really like a grid, so that was, that's another configuration of the same thing, which is a nice thing about a screen like this, is that it's not a static size and shape, right?
Is this a one-off, or do you do more than?
The screens have all been one-off, so that's, yeah. So another screen, again a geometric exercise. There are 48 square tiles here that are all identical, but they're rotated. And this is a kind of tile, it's a kind of pattern called the Truchet pattern, which is named after, I think, a 17th century French mathematician. So there are a lot of, any pattern where a tiling pattern where you can rotate an element and the pattern still lines up is a true shape pattern. So something as simple as, say, a square tile that's cut in half on the diagonal, so 2 triangles. You can imagine tiling a floor, and you can make patterns, big symmetrical patterns that line up, or you can make sort of random patterns. This one with these arcs, you know, however you rotate them, you get different shapes. What I'd love to be able to do is have something like this where you could reconfigure it on the fly, like if there were, you know, magnets involved or something, where you could take tiles out and change them, because there's so many different patterns. You could have them like totally uniform parallel lines, or big concentric circles, CBC logos, whatever. This was one I just kept fiddling with it until I found one that I like, because it's a fixed pattern. But I just like the turbulence of that. And
Do you have a picture of just one of the tiles?
yeah. So this is again pretty big. It's maybe 7 feet tall. It's a little bit. Each panel is about 20.
What did you use for a weight?
Well, so there's me holding a test piece, which was sort of a limited success. But so the tile body is MDF, so that I could route those grooves, and so that it would be dimensionally stable. I thought about, is there some way to do this with solid wood? And I figured not really, like to have that all hold together and not be blowing apart with movement. So it's MDF with thick oak veneer laid on the bias. And then on the table there are router jigs that I made to route the arcs. This probably would have been a good use case for a shapered origin, but it wasn't an option at the time. There's two jigs for the one tile, because if I tried to do all the grooves on one template, the grooves would be too close together. So I did them in 2 passes. So what I did after routing the grooves is I sprayed it with white lacquer and then ran them all through the thickness sander to clean off that top layer and get back to bare wood. And destroyed a couple of sanding belts in the process. There's so much lacquer coming out.
And every tile, that was the one tile you worked on, to create all those shapes?
That's basically the shape. So they're all, there's like a quarter circle, a primary quarter circle, and then there's like a secondary one that's intersected behind it, right? It's pretty cool though, the way that it just...
Cool.
Very good.
Super cool. Super cool.
So have you ever considered a design based on Astro? You know, like geese, fish, geese kind of thing?
I know what you mean, but no, I haven't.
Because, I mean, this sort of, it's somewhat similar in style, right? I mean, the Astro stuff is fairly geometric.
Yeah.
Or it can be, but it's the whole morphing from A to B and back again. That's is where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
So,
I think what I like about this is that each of those squares is the same, but your first impression is that it's a totally chaotic thing, but actually no, it's a very uniform thing in this pattern. It's just an artifact of that. And I guess I could have done it all the way down to the floor, but I think it worked better to just have that sort of bottom band of plain veneer. And then the back side, you see just veneer kind of on the bias, because the back side of each tile has the same diagonal veneer, but obviously not. Okay. So yeah, there's the sample tile. This was quite challenging to get everything to line up. In the end, the grooves don't line up perfectly, but I guess as a woodworker, I guess your natural inclination is you're looking at things on your bench from this far away, and you obsess about a thing that's off by 1/16 of an inch. But sometimes I have to tell myself, it looks good from 5 feet away, and that's really the main thing. And so I can look at it and see, oh, the lines don't exactly meet, whatever. Yeah, so there's all my tiles cut and ready for spraying. It was challenging to spray them, because when you spray with the gun, it doesn't really want to go down in those grooves, right? Like I put on so much lacquer to get it into those grooves, and then I had to sand most of it off. And then to connect the panels together, I had a machine shop make me these little brass links. So I wanted something that kind of blended into the round cylindrical shape of the panel styles, and that would allow the panels to fold flat in either direction. Okay, last screen. This is, again, taking something very simple, just riffs on walnut and making a pattern just through lines and the negative space between the slats. And in this case, the screen was being used to hide something, and there was a TV or something on a cart. So the bottom 2/3 of the screen needed to be more opaque, but then I could make it more open as we went up. So the gaps between the slats get progressively wider as you work your way up the panels. So that meant milling and cutting and sanding lots of little pieces. That's my helper Brendan, who used to run his own furniture business in the shop, but decided not to do that anymore. That's gluing together the main branches inside the frame. And luckily, Brendan had figured out that because of the angles, you could glue this whole thing up and still fit all of the slats in afterwards. Like putting a slat in the wide end and then just gradually packing them in.
What would the weight of that be?
It was actually not that heavy because the slats are only 1/4 inch thick, so, and it's walnut. So once the main frame was together, and you can see there's a 1/4 inch slot in all the pieces. So those main frame intersections, there's a floating tenon that goes into that slot. And then the ends of the slats also fit into that slot. So we made this frame that could stand it on its side with little shims to space all the slats at the right spacing. And then I went along with a dental syringe and epoxy along that rail, putting resin in between all the slats to lock them all in place. And then once that was cured, you could flip it over. And so all the way around, on all of the ends of the slats, they are being glued in after the fact. Because there's no way like you could assemble this with glue during the assembly run.
So were there any wood movement concerns or twisting concerns? I mean, it's real wood, right?
It's real wood, but the slats are not even 2 inches thick. So they all individually, there's going to be movement within each slat, but I'm not concerned about them en masse. Okay, and so that's it for screens for the moment. And now we're going to get into, there's a little detail. A similar kind of linkage between the panels, but these were just they were laser cut powder coated steel instead of brass. So, copper. So some time ago, the roof of, I think, the center block of Parliament was being redone, and someone in the government had the bright idea to save some so that things could be made out of it. It was, and so it went into crates in a warehouse, and then, as I understand, it was forgotten about, and then someone discovered it. Like one of the interior designers at Global Affairs discovered it and said, "Oh, what's this?" So fortunately, they thought of me and asked, "What can I do with this stuff, or would I like to work with it?" Yes, of course I would. So it's been a pretty popular thing with them, because when they're making sort of presentation pieces in an embassy or an official residence, having a connection to the Parliament buildings is a pretty obvious thing. So that's what it looks like. I brought in a few pieces you can see on direction. So I guess it fits with my kind of theme of taking imperfect or unglamorous materials and trying to make something interesting out of them. It's bent and torn, it's been stepped on, it's got scratches. So it seemed clear to me that whatever I did, I'd need to be breaking it down into small pieces so that I could work around the damaged bits, work around the big, where it's been bent. It's hard to flatten that out with it. You can't really flatten out the creases without damaging the patina, right?
I think that was off the best one.
Okay.
Which means it was 140.
There you go. So I start by, I go to the warehouse, I rummage through these bins, I find pieces that look like they have good colors. I bought these power shears just for the rough breakdown of the pieces, like ripping off the standing seam edges to get a reasonably flat panel. And then I have a little 8-inch wide shear that I can do really crisp cuts up to 8 inches wide, which seemed like enough because I was breaking it all down into small pieces anyways. So that's the cabinet that this is going in. This is the first one I did with copper, and it had just 3 little doors. And I came up with this diamond pattern. So each tile is maybe 6 inches square in a diamond shape. And because the copper is not super flat, I didn't want to trust that I was just going to glue it down. It's not like gluing a veneer down, it's crumpled. So I wanted to be able to use nails. And it didn't seem inappropriate given that it's roofing material, right? So I came up with a kind of a shingle pattern so that I could at least hide most of the nails and then just have nails around the edges. So again, doing the lay it all out on the bench trick and find a pattern that sort of makes sense in terms of like a gradient from light to dark, but not too obvious, mixing it up a little bit. The pieces, I don't really do anything to them except wash them in the sink to get all the grime off them. And then for pieces like this where the copper is going to be possibly touched, I put a clear coat of lacquer on it. In this case, they had a coat of lacquer before I started this final assembly, just so I wasn't getting fingerprints on it. So that's the little door. It's only about that big. And I'm overlapping these scales and nailing them down. And this being the first one, this is probably the best copper that they had, like really, really rich greens.
And they're fastened by nails?
Yep, so there's nails. Those are just normal nails, and they're hidden by the layer above. And then around the edges, there will be visible nails. And for those I used copper, and I chemically treated them to make them kind of green, so they sort of blended.
Are those kind of like the copper nails you use in boat building, where you clench the nail?
They're not as long as that, but they look kind of the same. I was just looking for something that was fairly flat on the top that wasn't, a big dome or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know how they used to, it's called verdigris?
Yeah.
Finish on that. Back in the day when they were putting, said they wanted green roofs.
Yeah.
So they used horseshoes
Yeah.
on the roofs to actually get oxidized.
Yeah. That's harder to come by now.
Yeah.
Apparently they collected it from the workers as well.
Apparently you had to be pregnant for it.
Well, plus there was a lot of like coal smoke in the air as well, and that accelerated. Yeah.
If you're interested in patterns, there's a very interesting pattern on Parliament Hill you may have never noticed. But the stonework is a
Yep.
definite pattern.
Okay.
I think it's called Scotch pattern. It was originally developed in Scotland to resist cannibals. Because if you use stackbone or
Sure.
something like that, it just breaks.
Yeah.
But because there's no straight lines across, it's much stronger.
Good.
And I have a guy, if you're interested in doing that, I have a guy he's a heritage-based service from Scotland.
Allegedly, one of my ancestors was one of those people who worked on Parliament.
Oh, okay.
So that's
beautiful.
that's fitting the doors, and these doors they're just like concealed hinges. They're not nothing fancy there, but still just want to get it reasonably reasonably tight in the case. And there's a little notch at the top because on these doors, you can see there, the pull at the top. I mean, this is not a really functional door pull, but I don't think anyone's ever going to open these doors. I made that from brass channel, so I cut little sections of brass channel, and then on the outside face of the channel, cut off the corners to make that little triangular pull.
I find it interesting the way because there's a different amount of vertically across the panel.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the way you use the variability.
Yeah. So that's when I'm laying it out. Like I had this sort of idea that, okay, some of them are darker and some of them are lighter. I will do kind of a light to dark or dark to light gradient, and I start laying that out. But then it, to me, usually works better if I just scramble that a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, you know, this one is darker, but, you know, if I put it up here, it wouldn't be as good. So,
No.
and there isn't like a definite way to do that other than to just stand on the step ladder and sort of see it all and fiddle around. That one was done a short time later, so it's 4 doors instead of 3, and I made 2 of them. Similar situation, the copper was a bit different. Sometimes with this, this was using just a solvent-based lacquer in a spray can, and it sometimes quite dramatically changes the color of the patina. So, like those ones that are quite brown, when they were uncoated, they probably look green. But pieces that have kind of a thin patina layer, the lacquer sort of saturates it, and what you really see is the copper underneath. And if it's a thicker patina, like those green and yellow ones, that's what you're seeing. And so a little bit hard to predict with that lacquer what you're going to get.
What kind of lacquer did you use?
So that was like a Mohawk aerosol, like acetone solvent lacquer. I've since figured out that the water-based lacquer that I use anyway on wood works fine on the copper, and it doesn't change the colors. So this is one that I did just in the spring. Same pattern, but with a black lacquered case. And the pulls are simpler, they're aluminum that I fabricated and also lacquered black.
What about sealing the copper prior to applying the lacquer?
Well, it's being sealed with the lacquer.
But it penetrates.
What's that?
But it penetrates.
It penetrates, but the water-based stuff, it gets really dark when the lacquer's wet, but when it dries, it goes back to looking more or less like it did. So that was a happy discovery because it's a little more predictable. When I'm working with the raw material, it's not going to suddenly change color. So again, little nails, those are little copper nails, which are pretty subtle, I think. I have no qualms about using the nails on this.
Now, the previous cabinet, those nails weren't copper, right?
They ended up being greener than I wanted, but that's,
Like those, they look silver here.
well, it's kind of a photo thing, but they were copper and they were green, but they just ended up, they ended up not, when the lacquer went on, they ended up being quite bright, and then the copper tiles ended up going dark, so I think there was less contrast before I sprayed it. And this was one, I guess I was asked to think about something that suggested like landscapes and Canadian landscape, and I was visiting my parents in Squamish, which is north of Vancouver, and trying to figure out what to do with this cabinet. And then the night before I left, I was in Vancouver on one of the beaches and looking north at this line of hills. And that was kind of my little aha moment, because there was a line of receding hills with different shading. And I thought, that's a pattern, let's abstract that. So,
Oh, that's spectacular. God's sake.
so the trick was to find copper that had the different shades that I needed to pull this off, and it worked out. Let's go back a couple slides, you can see. Again, laying it all out. So I had darker ones and lighter ones, and I think they're about 1 5/8 inches wide, and the doors had raised strips of ash, which is useful to kind of capture the edges of the copper and kind of hides the irregularity of the edges of the copper. And they overlap. So I was able to use nails, except for the top row, which I didn't want to use any nails on, and I really like I roughed up the back and just construction adhesive behind it. And so it was kind of tedious to glue it, because the pieces had to be set in there and then carefully clamped without shifting them.
What kind of wood is the substrate, the backstrate behind the copper?
So that would be particle board. The areas with copper, I believe, have like a phenolic backer on them as just a gluing substrate. Or it might have been raw, I can't remember. And then it's ash, solid ash on the case, and the strips, the vertical strips are solid ash, and then the band across the top that was shop sawn ash. So it's like heavy veneer, because I wanted to have the wood at the top is slightly crowded of the copper to make a little edge for the copper to like butt into. And the 4-inch doors and shelves inside. This case and the other lacquer cases that I've been doing lately, because I'm spraying them, I need to find a way to put together a case so that I can spray the interior before the whole thing's put together. Because maybe there's a way to do this, but I'm not a good enough spray finisher to like finish the interior of a cabinet where the whole thing's glued up and the back is on. You try to get in there with a spray and it's just a cloud of.
Yeah.
So in this case, it's kind of a stacked, like the top and bottom overlay the sides. So all those 4 panels can be sprayed first, the back can be sprayed, and then it's put together afterwards. In this cabinet, the sides, the top and the other side are mitered together, so that's one assembly, that inverted U. So that can be put together. We can spray the inside of that, spray the back, and then the bottom is put in from below. You can open it up enough to get the bottom in. So there's a strategy for being able to spray, do a spray cabinet.
That would get a whole bunch of fog.
Yeah.
Back. Yeah.
So that one, and let's go back to wood for a second. And that'll make sense in a second why I did that. So this is another pretty long cabinet. It's maybe 7 feet long. This was an experiment in making a pattern on the surface as opposed to assembling little pieces, right? So the doors, there's about 2 doors, right? Yeah. So those are veneered in thick white oak veneer, again on a particle board substrate with solid edging. And then I carefully laid out my center points and set up my router trammel, and then I plowed this 1/8 wide groove.
The center point of your router trammel, that's
Yeah.
just double-sided taped on?
Yeah. So carefully worked my way across and got the radius just right so that those arcs meet, right? And then I used the dental syringe with black epoxy to fill that, to make a really solid, to make a really solid black line for the pattern. And then also because I wanted to do the shading with the steel wool vinegar solution that you can use to darken oak. So I wanted to have like a waterproof boundary between the different regions of wood, so that as I'm brushing on the solution, I don't want it bleeding into the next region, right? So I don't have a picture of that process, I only have video, so it's not in the slideshow, but I had thought about like plowing a groove, say with a V-bit, and then painting that to make a little trench between the different regions of the pattern. But in the end, I thought it worked better to fill it with epoxy and sand it flat.
How to do, sorry, you put the epoxy in, you do it slightly proud, and then sand flush?
I put it in so it's pretty level with the surface, just to have less, because with 1/16 veneer, there's quite a bit of leeway to take it down.
And then, would you not have found it, just a question, would it not have been easier to have done the different colors and everything else, leaving it, just leaving the grooves, so you've got like a canal, a break between each one?
Yep.
And then just fill in the difference with the epoxy after?
I don't know what you mean.
Like, I think, well, I guess it didn't work that way because it came out okay, but if I was trying to think of it, I would have thought, put the epoxy in first, then put the finish on.
Yeah.
And if any bleeds over the epoxy into the other one, or if you're trying to wipe it off of the surface of the epoxy, you might graze the other side.
Well, in the end, the epoxy band was wide enough that I could brush the finish on, say, this part without, just with the foam brush, without like slopping over into the next ones.
Yeah.
I go back more sense. I start, so this one is, this has an oil finish on it. That's the white oil there, like just with the oil. And then these ones have, like I made up this little tub of the stain, the vinegar solution. And that's cut 1:75, a tiny amount in of that solution with water, and then brush that on, and then I did that across the door, working from the lighter to the darker areas. So if I spilled the light into the next one, it wouldn't matter much because the dark one was next. So the one that mattered is like when I'm doing this one at the bottom, which is sort of like maybe 1 to 5 strength, that I don't. So. Yeah. That 1/8 boundary was enough that I didn't have to worry about it too much. So a lot of time staring at this to get everything to line up and figure out a pattern of light and dark that was consistent. And then sliding doors need some kind of hole that you can get your finger in, but that doesn't stick out too much, right? Because it's going to hit the door. So I cut those little, a 1-inch Forstner bit made a little socket in the door, and a 1-inch 10-inch cutter to make a little plug. But before cutting the plug, I used a router bit in the drill press to hollow out that. So use the router bit to make the hollow, and then switch it over to the tenon cutter to punch it out. And then just, I like the way it sits along.
That's really cool, yeah. And that's proud, like what?
Like an eighth tops, and there's enough clearance on the door. So I called it the transit cabinet because it reminded me of those images where astronomers plot the transit of Venus across the face of the sun, right? And that was, so the base had this kind of post and beam detail with these round legs. So it started out square, and we did the joinery with the Panther router, and then made the cylinders with the router table. And I'm very fortunate, that's Brandon in the background, and I'm very fortunate to have an assistant who I can just kind of sketch out this idea in a quick conversation, and then he just does it. Like, it's a luxury. So the stretchers of the base slot into those legs. I guess that one in the foreground is maybe that middle leg, that's so that the rail goes right through it, and then there's pretty chunky. So there's the side view. Okay, and then the last one, this one is still in the shop in a crate.
That's beautiful. Oh my
So I
goodness.
put this out at the end because
It's kind of like everything coming together.
This is for, the residence that this is going into is Spanish colonial revival style, which means it's full of these big semicircular arches, right? And when I saw the photo of all the arches, it got me thinking about this pattern. is if you cut that in half, then you get the semicircles. And then I realized where two semicircles overlap, you get a Gothic arch, which is what's on the Parliament building. So that was
Brilliant.
like enough of a hook, right? So, and then I was thinking back to that other one, the landscape one, with the light and dark. If I could just wrangle the right copper, then I could really pull off an interesting pattern. It worked out. So this is 70 inches long and 32 inches high. The two big doors, and I'm just carefully laying it out. Some similar details with the round legs, maybe not quite as complicated. Again, the three-sided box with the waterfall on the top two edges that capture a bottom panel. And the bottom panel has a short tongue that goes into a groove on the sides. So we can finish the interior and put it upside down and just open it enough to drop the bottom in and glue it together. There's little details like the front edge of those has a big radius on it, which kind of echoes those curves. The legs are round again, just to echo that shape. And the interior is a lacquer that's kind of like the greenish gray, matches or coordinates with the copper. So that's a thing that I often do, like the shelf and the inside of the back will be a red color. And again, the nails. You can see it's pretty beat up stuff. But I kind of like from a distance, it's like this very dramatic thing. And then you get closer and you see all the warts, right? So.
Have you tried like etching in patterns into the copper to like expose the raw?
I want to, yeah. And there's the last piece here that's not copper, but it has a copper origin story, I guess. And then I'd like to do something where I'm not just doing the copper on a flat surface, like something three-dimensional where I can have the patina on one side and polish the other side. And that would be, there's this lampshade, so this is just a speculative thing. I've sold one of these to someone, but it started as an exercise in this copper is interesting, and what if we made a three-dimensional object out of it instead of always making it as a door, right? And if a lamp, some kind of pendant shade would be an interesting way to do that, because with a light source inside and the backside is polished, then it'd be quite a dramatic. Because you know, it's 100 years old on the one side, but it's still, you know, you sand it, it's bright, shiny copper, right? It's kind of old and new at the same time. So I come up with this idea, but that copper is not something I can just work with on my own. It comes out of a government warehouse. It has to be signed out. All the scraps go back in a box. Like it's a heritage asset, so I can't just decide to make this. But I had the design and I wanted to try it, so I made it out of just some maple veneer as a proof of concept, which worked okay, but it wasn't quite sturdy enough. Then this spring, just to like, it's nice to work on just totally speculative pieces every now and then. This is one of them, to make it into a floor lamp. So I figured out how to make, there are 5 rows of these petals, each with 6 pieces. Each row is a slightly different size, at a slightly different angle, and they're folded at a slightly different angle. I laminated maple paperback veneer over a core of raw maple veneer to make this basically a 5-ply sandwich, right, of wood, paper, wood, which is a reasonably rigid sheet. And then I walked down the path to City Center where there's a laser, in Ottawa City Woodshop, there's a laser cutting guy in there. So from my CAD model, he was able to cut out all my parts and put holes in them. So they're all very uniform. See, there's a little bit of burning on the edges from the laser, but that sanded off really quickly. And then I made a little jig so I could glue So the long edge of each piece has to be beveled so that they join together. So I made a table logic to do that. Then I glue them together, sand them. And then those holes are precisely located from the CAD model that when you connect the pieces together with wire at those points, there's really only one shape that you can get out of this. Which is kind of an idea that I picked up from my boat builder tenant, right? Because if you've ever heard of stitching glue, where you make something like a kayak or a rowboat out of flat sheets of marine plywood they're a certain shape. When you make those edges together and connect them, it makes a 3D shape, and it can only make one shape. So this is kind of the same idea, that once you connect them, so that's all those two-piece petals glued together, ready for their final sanding, and just give them a coat of lacquer.
How did you work out the angles? Like what required angle for each of the, what was you saying, 6 layers or five layers or 6 each?
Well, I have a SketchUp model, and I just started playing with, put them in a ring, and then I guess I had this idea that I wanted to have this kind of organic pine cone shape, that the angles of the petals would sort of start a little bit above vertical and then work their way down. So I just started with, well, let's make them 10 degrees different. And I wanted to have kind of taper in at the bottom, so the petals at the top are smaller and at the bottom are smaller, and they get bigger in the middle so they spread out more. And then the pairs at the top are flatter, and as they work their way down, they close up more. So it's a little tweak in the model. So each row is 10 degrees more closed up and 10 degrees down. And then you can keep changing that, and then ultimately, when it's a shape that I like, then you can figure out exactly where those intersections are. So where two petals meet, cut them, and then unfold it and send it to the laser guy.
Yeah.
And then when you put it back together,
Yeah. There you go.
yeah.
Now, sorry, I got so many comments. My first one is, congratulations, that's a thing of beauty.
Thank you.
I've seen a whole bunch of different designs coming out nowadays for, stand-up lamps and stuff like that, and they seem, each one seems more impractical than the other, like style over substance, virtually unusable. This looks really cool, and I think it would work really, really well. I like the design a lot. What are you using for the, I guess you call it the stems that holds the base of each one of the petals?
So there's kind of a cage made out of brass rod so there's 6 of these sort of curved spokes with a little arm.
Yeah.
And I just bent that with a little fixture in the shop. And they disappear into, there's a wooden hub underneath the socket. So again, those go up, they're curved to kind of follow the contours of the inside of the shade, and then they're horizontal to pick up the ridge of the second row of petals are basically resting on that. And the idea was, I don't know if I'll ever sell one of these, but it was fun. That whole shade assembly comes off the base. The legs.
Is it just sitting there?
No, it's screwed in, but it comes off.
Yeah.
So that can be packed separately. The legs detach from the hub. The cord is running a groove in one of the legs, but the whole thing can break down, so it's not totally impractical if I needed to ship one somewhere.
Yeah. And then what are you using
my
for
God, look at that.
what kind of light is that on the inside?
That is, on this prototype, it's a big globe, what's called a G40 LED bulb. But I think if I were to do this again, I would have a glass. I could put a glass globe in there and then a normal bulb inside it. Maybe. And then, because Also, the glow bulb is a good size, but if you just screw it into a socket, you see a little bit of the neck of the bulb.
Yeah.
And I didn't want that. So there's a bit of brass tube here that's kind of hiding it hides the socket and it hides the kind of straight neck of the bulb, so all you really see is just the round spherical part of the bulb. And here, so you can see it's just connected with little twists of brass wire. And that's a tedious process to put that together, because you're like doing this the whole time.
The joints were the fiberglass, or what did
In the end, so I made a little jig with just a V groove at the required angle, and the two pieces that are going in have a bevel to meet. So I would just use the Starbond CA glue, the heavy Starbond, and just put a bead on one edge, spray the edge of the mating of the piece that's going to attach to it, and just jam them in that little jig and hold them. And then run a bead of CA, the medium, along the inside, like as a fillet on the inside. So, and once the clear coat of lacquer goes on, it kind of all disappears.
Yeah, I was gonna ask how you find those pieces together.
Well, just like, and you can let go, you know, in 5 seconds you can let go and pop it
It's a
off.
non-issue.
Yeah.
And you probably didn't use any accelerator on
No, so I would put the glue on one side,
Accelerator in the other.
zap the other piece with the accelerator, jam it in place.
But when you do the fillet,
Yep,
if you use accelerator on that, you run the risk of the bubble.
the Starbond stuff, they don't pay me to say this, but the accelerator is slower. It's not as aggressive, because some of them, yeah, it will do that. The Starbond is a little more gentle, and so you can have a thicker fillet, and it's not going to go all. I mean, I say thick, it's not.
Yeah. I mean, it dries pretty quick.
Yeah, but so that's after that process of doing them all. So it's fairly quick to get through that. Of course, you have to figure out all those steps, but the actual doing it is not that hard. And I think maybe that's it. So this is maybe something I want to pursue more, like doing three-dimensional things.
So the cool thing about gluing out copper is you could actually make the whole thing and just bend it.
Well, that was exactly what that starter was, with this idea with copper and being able to fold it. But I had this veneer lying around, so I thought, well, maybe I could join it.
I wonder what that would look like, using that patented copper, but polish the underside so
Yeah.
it's straight copper. So you get the reflectance of
That's the idea. So hopefully someone will go for that. And then in that case, I could rivet the pieces together. And obviously, it would weigh a lot more as copper. And it would not be practical as a floor lamp because the shade would be 20 pounds. But as a pendant, appropriately suspended, it could be pretty cool. So I think that's the last. That's it.
Yeah, you can get Parliament to hire you to actually
Chris, just a note, when you're using the copper,
Yep.
you're singly responsible for us not being able to get maple leaf pins made out of the copper from the Parliament buildings, because we ordered about 2,000 of them when we were in LA.
Yeah.
We gave them out to the Canadian diaspora there, like on, Academy Awards or whatever it was. And then all of a sudden we couldn't get them. I wonder why.
Originally,
Oh, look at this. Look at that.
So here's some scraps.
Oh, isn't that beautiful?
so Roger, when we originally thought of doing this, because I was involved with that, it was to actually give the copper to disabled adults, to actually make those pins that they sold in the gift shop. But I am so pleased that they've expanded that to give it to artisans.
Oh, yeah, I think it's fabulous.
Chris, to actually do something absolutely spectacular.
I know it's been given to other people, but I've only seen
Yeah.
a couple, literally 2 other things. So it's a challenge, like working with the government, the challenge is to see what happened, right? So they're not very forthcoming with images after the fact.
It's not only global affairs, because I've seen some of it done, the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, there were 1 or 2 pieces in there. They're not furniture, but they're more artistic with that copper. And so it's fabulous.
Cool. That's what I have.
It's lovely. What a presentation.
Thank you so much.
No kidding.
Really
Oh my
appreciate it.
God.
So if you want to come and take a look.